The British Army of the First World War was led by a class of men distinct from the ordinary soldiers, the officers. Officers were men commissioned by the King to lead his army. But how did he choose these men, and what training did they have? The British officer of the early 20th century is often stereotyped as an aristocratic fool who gained his rank by virtue of his birth or breeding. Think Lieutenant George in Blackadder, or indeed practically any officer portrayed on screen. The reality was quite different. In this video, we'll explore the process by which men were appointed to commissions in the regular army before the outbreak of war, forming the corps of officers which took the British Army to war in 1914. In stark contrast to the popular image of incompetent, blundering fools, the regular British officer was a highly trained soldier, and it was with this training that the journey to becoming an officer began. There were four main routes to obtaining a commission as an officer. By far the most common way was to attend one of the Army's two officer training establishments, the Royal Military College at Sandhurst for infantry and cavalry officers, or the Royal Military Academy at Woolwich for artillery and engineer officers. For the purpose of this video, we'll focus primarily on officers joining the infantry and cavalry. These courses varied in length, but the course at Sandhurst generally consisted of a year to 18 months training. In order to gain entry to Sandhurst, candidates first had to pass a series of examinations. Potential officers had to hold a leaving certificate from a professionally inspected school, which included both independent and grammar schools. If they did not have this certificate, they could sit an initial exam for a qualifying certificate, which proved they had attained the necessary standard of education. This standard was set at the same level required to matriculate at a university. Those who held a leaving or qualifying certificate could then apply to sit the competitive examination. This examination was held by the Civil Service Commissioners, the same body which regulated admission to the civil service, which eliminated interference on the part of serving army officers. The exam paper included a variety of subjects, ranging from mathematics to Latin. It was a very thorough test of the candidate's intellectual ability, and some of the exams included both a written paper and a practical element. If successful, and if enough places were available, candidates would be offered a place at the Royal Military College, Sandhurst. This system of examination undoubtedly favoured candidates who had received a classical education, predominantly those who were privately educated, though a significant number of grammar school boys were successful in the exams. In addition, successful candidates were required to pay fees to train at Sandhurst, like a university. In 1914, the annual fee was £150, around £21,000 in 2024. As a result, although applications for Sandhurst were technically open to anyone, officers who obtained their commissions by this route tended to be from wealthier families and to have attended private schools, though there were some from other walks of life. At the end of the course, candidates underwent a final series of examinations, this time in military subjects, including tactics, navigation and topography, military law, field engineering, and military history. If successful here, they were commissioned as second lieutenants and could apply to be appointed to a regiment. If a candidate failed the examinations to gain entry to Sandhurst, or was unable to qualify for some other reason, there were other ways to obtain a commission, often referred to as entry via the back door. One option was to join the Special Reserve, known until 1908 as the Militia, an auxiliary force in which it was possible to be commissioned as an officer without passing any examinations, provided the candidate had attained a leaving certificate or could otherwise demonstrate that they had completed a full secondary education. Special Reserve officers could then apply to transfer to the regular army. They were attached to regular units for extended periods of training and then sat a competitive examination in military subjects, similar to the final examinations at Sandhurst. If successful, they were appointed to a commission in the regular army. This was often a way for men from less affluent backgrounds who could not afford the fees to attend Sandhurst to become officers, but it was also frequently used by members of the upper classes who found that they could not pass the examinations to attend Sandhurst, or could not afford to. The other backdoor route to becoming an officer was through a university. If it wasn't obvious by now, education was the single most important factor in determining whether someone was suitable to become an officer. Therefore, the army believed that an undergraduate degree was sufficient evidence that a man was qualified to lead soldiers. Of course, university candidates, as they were known, had to learn how to be soldiers too. Alongside their studies, they trained in an officer training corps, a unit of the part-time territorial force dedicated to providing military training to students. They also had to serve at least 2 periods of several weeks attached to a regular unit, learning on the job. Since they didn't receive as thorough training as the other officers, the number of commissions granted to university candidates was significantly limited. The army viewed the commissioning of some highly educated men as a good thing, but was reluctant to have too many of them at the expense of those with more military experience. As a result, it was very difficult to obtain a commission via the university route. In 1905, for example, candidates from all 4 Scottish universities competed for just 7 available commissions. Finally, it was also possible, though uncommon, for commissions to be granted to ordinary enlisted soldiers serving in the regular army. Many of these were senior soldiers commissioned into their own regiments as quartermasters. Others were soldiers commissioned as combatant officers on the basis of merit, usually in recognition of exceptional service or gallantry. The possibility of eventually becoming an officer was an attraction for some men of lower social class and limited education to enlist in the army, but the chance of success was low. Some educated men who enlisted, known as gentlemen rankers, did obtain commissions, and this had become quite common during the Second Anglo-Boer War. However, by 1914 it wasn't a realistic career path, and Sandhurst, the Special Reserve, and the universities became the main sources of infantry officers. To have even the slightest chance of becoming an officer, therefore, one needed a good education above all else. Social class itself was not assessed at any point in the application process, but the level of education required meant that for the most part, working class men had little prospect of becoming officers direct from civilian life. On the other hand, despite having perhaps the most clearly defined socio-economic class system ever seen, the Edwardian period saw a notable degree of social mobility within that system. The middle class grew as entrepreneurs and business owners flourished, becoming in many cases wealthier and more powerful than the aristocracy and gentry. For many of these self-made men, sending their sons to independent schools was a signal of their social status, and this in turn prepared them to pursue a commission. At the same time, the developing economy enabled more people to save money and, in some cases, to give their children a better start in life. To highlight just one example, Robert Keddy, a Glaswegian warehouse foreman, was able to save enough to send his son to a minor private school and on to Sandhurst, and a commission in the Black Watch. Furthermore, the foundation of many grammar schools and universities in the period made this education more accessible to the middle classes than ever. As a result, while the officer corps was not a cross-section of society by any means, neither was it dominated by the upper classes. That said, a certain level of wealth was still essential. The expensive fees at Sandhurst and the universities were one thing, but the lifestyle expected of an officer once he joined his regiment meant that candidates needed a private income. It was almost impossible for an officer to live on his pay alone, which had not been increased since before the Second Boer War. Officers had to purchase their own uniform and equipment, which could cost several £100s, over £10,000 today when adjusted for inflation. In addition, they were expected to uphold a lifestyle befitting their position, paying a weekly subscription to live and dine in the officers' mess. The British regular officer of 1914 was, therefore, generally an educated and highly trained soldier. The officer corps included members of the aristocracy, but it was dominated by the upper middle class, the sons of professionals, businessmen, and other military officers. But social class itself was not formally assessed at any point in the process of becoming an officer. Rather, the strict educational requirements and financial barriers shaped the demographic while technically allowing anyone to apply for a commission. Of course, this situation was about to be drastically altered by the outbreak of the First World War, but I'll discuss that in another video.